Because in the Noah story, or for those of you who are familiar with Near Eastern history, the flood story is much older, and it's sort of a reinterpretation of a far more ancient narrative. Part of it is featured in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written down about 1,000 years before the book of Genesis, although there are versions of the flood story that go back further than that. And of course, most famously, God's covenant is embodied by his bow, his rainbow. And it, of course, has since become a symbol of LGBT inclusivity. If you look at the rainbow in indigenous contexts, it's venerated as a living deity, particularly in the Peruvian Andes. And one of the most beautiful signs of, again, that coming together of indigenous and Christian motifs is this image of Catherine of Siena. And in her hagiography, she kind of famously floats upon a cloud. There's a miracle that's performed. Well, when indigenous people saw the engraving and reinterpreted it based on their worldview, they have her riding on a rainbow, which to me sort of speaks to the fact that, God may be light, but what is the rainbow? But different facets of that light, different reflections of God. You turn a prism, you hold it up to the light, and you can see the light in all of its complexities, that which is visible and invisible. So I thought it was a good place to start. And again, thinking about reclaiming Genesis as a space of affirmation, rather than a space of sort of dogmatic ideas about gender and spirituality. Historians don't have a monopoly on the past. We're not the only discipline that looks at change over time. Literature has their methodologies. In religious studies, there are kind of sacred histories and mythic histories. But what academic historians do is we mostly focus on historiography, or not just writing history and being attentive to our footnotes, but also looking at the history of history. How does history change over time? How do interpretations emerge in specific contexts? More importantly, how do new technologies, new tools, new ways of knowing enable us to look further and deeper into the past and ask new questions? So again, we're always asking, who's writing history? And indeed, while Genesis is not a literal history, it is a historical text. There are multiple authors, and each of these authors had specific agendas, and we'll talk a little bit about those agendas. What types of sources do historians analyze? When we're looking at the construction of a historical narrative, what sources are they using? Whether it's the footnotes in a secondary source, whether it's looking at the book of Shemuel or book of Samuel and the book of Kings to see what are the original primary sources the author is drawing from to tell this story, or even further back, how do oral histories become scripture? We're always interested in this, and of course, we're also very mindful of the fact that as much as we try to be objective, as much as we try to, recognizing we can't see historical sources the way God sees them, but to try to take an as expansive eye view as possible, we're always going to be held back by our limitations, our senses, our particular moment in history. Again, the people who lived in the 1st century CE, the people who lived in the time of Jesus were very good historians. Despite the fact they didn't have access to carbon-14 dating and they weren't as proficient at philology or the study of linguistic change over time. So nevertheless, we can give credit where credit is due as long as we can situate people and actors in their specific context. And of course, ultimately, how does one's own perspectives contribute to a kind of historical bias? So, looking at the book of Genesis, if as some scholars posit, some of it was written down during the first Davidic kingdom or the united rule of Israel, one of the agendas of the biblical author or the editors is to map the present, and in that time, a monarchy back into the pre-monarchical or tribal past. And so they're making an argument about the present by looking at these fragments of oral history and trying to make sense out of it. So they're trying to take the distant past and make it a usable past, and that'll of course change with the exile. And of course, for we Catholics, when a young, Galilean rabbi named Yeshua looks at these scriptures and sees, something entirely more fulfilling. And finally, again, how do these historical interpretations change over time? So the questions that they were asking in David and Solomon's generation are connected but quite different than the questions that people were asking in the post-exilic generations, and certainly very different, although related to the questions that people in Jesus' time were looking for. For those of you who have read the document, Male and Female, He Created Them, and considered its impact on trans people or other individuals who don't conform to the Vatican's prescribed roles of sex and sexuality, this has sort of, I think very rightly felt like a slap in the face, particularly as Father James Martin has noted. This document, while erudite in its theology, has made no attempt to interact with or even consider the lived experiences of LGBT plus Catholics, nor has it seriously engaged in the growing body of scholarly literature on the genetics of sexuality and biology. It kind of dismisses gender inclusivity as an ideology of the 1960s that Michel Foucault kind of rolled out of bed one morning after Woodstock, and everybody started choosing their genders. I mean, I'm sort of being glib here, but if you read the statements by Cardinal, by Pope Emeritus Benedict, blaming the sex abuse crisis on the culture, on the sexual revolution of the 60s, there is this kind of hidebound thinking that gender and sexuality, as we understand it, is a recent invention. And Genesis gives the lie to that, as we'll see in a moment. But I want to just read for you what the Vatican has said, specifically using the book of Genesis as an instrument to deny the humanity of our LGBT plus brothers and sisters, particularly trans brothers and sisters. It says, Christian anthropology has its roots in the narrative of human origins that appears in the book of Genesis, where we read, God created man in his own image, male and female he created them, Genesis 1:27. These words capture not only the essence of the story of creation, but also of that life-giving relationship between men and women, which brings them into intimate union with God. The self is completed by one who is the other than the self, according to the specific identity of each person, and both have a point of encounter forming a dynamic reciprocity which is derived and sustained by their creator. So a fairly authoritative reading of the book of Genesis, but certainly not a historical reading. While we can talk about what it means to be divinely inspired during the conversation we have later, I think we can credibly argue that the 10th century editors or first writers of this scroll really weren't thinking about the sort of landscape of the early 21st century. And I think reasonably thinking, if church fathers had access to the various peer-reviewed studies that show that sexuality and gender are not choices, and that biology is not destiny, they would, update their theology accordingly. But as we have it, here we could see the book of Genesis being used not in the sense that it was originally, created as kind of a theological, mythological origin story to explain the historical present, but as a way to foreclose on sort of the evolution of this doctrine as the human species learns more about creation and what it means to be the created. So we'll come back to this in a minute. The other place where we see church leaders bringing Genesis out of its historical context and into a kind of ideological space is, of course, the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And the Catechism cites 5 scripture verses to justify this totalizing and sweeping denunciation of its LGBT brothers and sisters, specifically Genesis 19, 1 through 29, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which we'll touch upon very briefly. And then, of course, those lines in Romans, Corinthians, and Timothy, which we've talked about a bit on the Vine and Fig Forum. We're not really going to touch on those today. But again, arguably, what the Catechism is trying to do is apply or retroactively map a 20th century, 21st understanding of the human condition, human sexuality, capacity for love, etc., and make it fit a kind of Bronze Age, Iron Age taxonomy that these books were never meant to do, and specifically Genesis 19. On the other side, though, creation stories, when used properly, so if you ever read the Theology of the Body, or you've had to sit through a homily where the priest talks about the correct use and misuse of creation, I can push back, and what I hope to kind of push back and invite some conversation later on is, just as there are responsible ways to interact with creation and irresponsible ways to interact with creation, not just related to sexuality, right? But also, what is the intention of a creation story? How does it function in its original context? What kind of work, theologically speaking, historically speaking, is it supposed to do? And Ronald Garrett, who is he's at the University of South Carolina, he proposes a new framework to consider, not a new framework, but actually a more useful framework to think about creation stories, not just in the Catholic context, but in a global context, and think about how they fit into the natural law, the same natural law the Catechism claims says that is anathema to LGBT plus people. So here's what it says. He says, creation stories surely are vehicles for the crystallization of and expressions of certain religious outlooks, rather than a mythological foundation for dogmatically asserted divine commands, especially those divine commands that hold us fixed to roles such as gender roles and sexual identities. Creation stories illuminate the relation between nature and juridical concepts in natural law by clarifying two aspects or moments of natural law, both independently and in their interrelation. So what does he mean by this? Well, to understand how the land, in many respects, is the source of the law, I'd like to turn our attention to Native American creation stories, specifically the Patwin story. I'm speaking to you from the Central Valley of California, and the indigenous peoples who are still part of this land, the Patwins, do not emerge out of the Garden of Eden as much as they are recreated, wait for it, after wildfires. And man wanted to couple with the first female, but he's kind of a jerk, and so she wants nothing to do with him. And so he gets angry and sets the world on fire, but he escapes in a Thule boat. And by setting the world on fire, he wipes out all of humanity. Well, amidst the smoke and fire, two children who are running to escape from the destruction encounter Coyote, who in a California native context is a trickster figure. He's always trying to help man, oftentimes by beguiling supernatural forces, and sometimes he gets into some misadventures on his own. And what Coyote does is, amid the wreckage, he creates a sweat lodge, and in the sweat lodge, the people, he starts dancing, and he's dancing so ferociously, and it gets hotter and hotter, and the sticks that he has brought into the sweat lodge become the first human beings. What's the usual past we can discern from this? Well, ultimately, what the story argues is that their relationships are first and foremost structured by cycles of destruction and rebirth, and that the land might erase or destroy old gender roles or old way of doing things, but it will also renew them in fire. So once again, right, the natural law, what these people perceived as the basis for their law emerges out of the demands the land puts on them. And again, as we head into wildfire season, in California, we need to be mindful that out of destruction there was also creation, and that's the story that the Patwins were trying to preserve. Which brings us to Genesis. Genesis is doing many of the same things, if not all of the same things, that these indigenous creation stories are doing. The difference is, about 3,000 years ago, they moved out of oral tradition and into the written word. They have taken on a new life. And one of the things we want to be mindful of is that in the 21st century, a book is something you could buy on Amazon.com. It comes between two covers. Everything you need to know is between the covers of those books. Typically, you read them linearly from front to back, unless you're using a choose-your-own-adventure course or you skip to the end. Books in the first millennium BCE, quite different. As you know, these are scrolls. They're not very portable. They're not broken down by chapter and verse. And it's very easy for people to cut and paste, to splice them together, to make edits and revisions. And the idea of single authorship to receive copyrights was not something that the biblical authors would have been, familiar with. So for those of you who are familiar with the JPED thesis, during the 19th century, a German theologian analyzed the Old Testament, particularly the first five books of the Hebrew Bible, the Pentateuch or the Torah, and based on vocabulary, based on forms of the Hebrew language, based on the themes that each of these sections seem to emphasize, they concluded that there were at least 4 or 5 different sources or documents from which the Old Testament, as we know, was edited and put together. For anyone who's read an edited volume in academia understands this, but for most people in the pews, in a parish church, this is a bit inaccessible. So what we see in the creation story of Genesis is not one, but 2 creation stories, written by 2 different authors at 2 different times. And again, the Yahwist, some of the oldest material in the Old Testament. Anytime you hear the Lord, when you're in the liturgy, that's referring to the Yahwist. This deity looks a lot like a Canaanite war deity. As we see in the story of Adam and Eve, he's very anthropomorphic. He's walking in the garden, enjoying the cool of the evening. He does things that humans do. Whereas the priestly source, much later, and arguably the author of the first creation story in the beginning, God is much more all-powerful. God is much more cosmic. And it shows that not only, people's relationship with God is evolving, but also the ancient Hebrews' understanding of who God is evolving. Of course, we as Catholics affirm that ultimately God reveals himself through his Son, Jesus Christ. But not everyone subscribes to that view. So again, Genesis can speak to lots of audiences. I think by virtue of the fact that this is a book that is the work of many human hands, all of whom are grasping at divine truths as perfectly or as imperfectly as they can, Genesis does not lend itself to a kind of monopolizing interpretation that some would have you follow. So you can't get dogmas just in terms of A, how to theoretically read a creation story, but B, how this text comes together. It doesn't mean it doesn't have a great deal to teach us, but it just reminds us that we have to be very theological. We have to always be contextualizing words and meanings in their sort of original ecosystem, if you will, and then evaluate how those meanings have changed over time. So here's an example of just how intricately even the construction of the Hebrew language informs the meaning of Scripture. This is from Robert Alter's translation. He's a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. What I like about Robert Alter's translation of the Hebrew Bible is that his emphasis is at once, trying to make the words as accessible as possible in English, without impoverishing the literary qualities of the book of Genesis. Because even though the book of Genesis seems to have multiple authors, interestingly enough, and again, right down to very small details, this book has a tight literary coherence. So it opens itself up to literary as well as historical interpretation. And what Alter wants us to be attentive to is that the poetics themselves are also important in understanding both a theology of creation that's being articulated in this particular scroll, as well as the complexities embedded therein. So, I'm sure many of you have heard, in the beginning, the earth was without form and void, the sort of the King James version of this. Here's what Robert Alter says. He says, when God began to create heaven and earth, and all the earth then was welter and waste, and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters, God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from darkness. So, a couple of things going on here. First, in the original Hebrew, Alter is trying to recapture the kind of nonsensical alliteration through the term welter and waste. The Hebrew tohu wabuhu really only appears in this context and a few others, as he sort of notes in this footnote. And again, it's a way of saying, the earth was helter-skelter. It was higgledy-piggledy. It's a nonsensical word that gives us a sense of what that chaos that God is ordering sort of feels like. So it's a multi-sensory encounter that sort of has persisted from the oral tradition. Also, in the book of Genesis, in the original Hebrew, you won't see the word but. You won't see, any other sort of connecting language except the word than. So it kind of sounds like it's kind of breathless, right? Earth then was welter and waste, and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters, and God said, let there be light. So there is a rhythm, there is a cadence there that you won't really fully appreciate just by reading the word on the page. A book like Genesis is meant not only to be read, but to be heard, to be meditated upon. It's a kind of a prism that you hold up to the light, and you want to see different facets of the rainbow. All this to say is that in many ways, the poetics of Genesis are more important for reclaiming and understanding its meaning rather than kind of legalistic, almost juridical interpretations, which you kind of see in sort of the young earth creationists. No, God literally said it was 6 days, and you can go to a museum in Kentucky and see that. That's not what we're concerned with. We can see the artistry and the beauty of God's word by getting into the Hebrew and not inhabiting its literal meaning. Of course, the line that folks at the Vatican really keyed into, this piece from Genesis 1:26 to 28, God said, let us make a human in our image, by our likeness, to hold sway over the fish of the sea, and the fowls of the heavens, and the cattle, and the wild beasts, and all the crawling things that crawl upon the earth. And then the author shifts into this couplet, and God created the human in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. This is an important line, not because the Vatican says it so, but because Jesus will refer back to this in Matthew 19, when he outlines his theology of marriage, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But again, I want you to key into that couplet, right? It's a poetic verse. And in it, it kind of has a chiastic structure. And what do I mean by a chiastic structure? Well, in English, we tend to put our topic sentences at the beginning of our paragraphs. In Hebrew poetics, and this will persist into the New Testament, the crux of the argument is at the center of the paragraph, the center of the story, the center of the sentence even. It's always in the middle, right? That, for Christians, it's very easy, right? It's the intersection of the cross is what we're looking for. And he says this, right? And God created the human in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. It's a very intentional play on gender pronouns that ultimately isn't about creating gender binaries, but I want to argue, is that ultimately it's to recognize that our creation is always in relation to others, that we are interdependent beings. both with those with whom we share our life, with whom we are accountable, and also to our Creator. Without those relationships, we are nothing. And that's the argument that the theological interpretation based on my reading of history and linguistics that I want to posit, and we can talk about this later. But here's what Alter says. Again, sort of keying into the original Hebrew. He says a human, the term Adam, is consistently used with a definite article, which is used both here and in the second account, or the Adam and Eve story, of the origins of humankind. It's a generic term for human beings, not a proper noun. This is genderless. It does not automatically suggest maleness, especially not without the prefix of ben, son of. And so the traditional rendering man is misleading in an exclusively male Adam. And this also goes back to that Patwin creation story I referred back to, where there was a sense of male and female, and they definitely had a spat, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the first people. So there's this concept of male and female, or yin and yang, these kind of concepts that are not embodied and certainly do not refer to the way genitalia interact with each other as the way the Vatican document would suggest it would. Moreover, again, when God says, in the image of God, He created him, it is, the pronoun in Hebrew, but it's not anatomically masculine. Rashi was an 11th century Jewish sage. He lives in southern France, and he's writing just before the Crusades. His reading of the book of Genesis, of course, is an argument not about necessarily ecological relationships. In Rashi's day and age, he's very concerned with this idea of the kingdom of Israel returning to the Holy Land. And so his interpretation of Genesis and his exegesis on Genesis really make that argument. But what I do want to key into here with Rashi's commentary on Genesis 1:26 is that when God says we will make man, or we will make the human, what Rashi's concerned with is that God is speaking in the second person, we will make man. Well, Catholics will say, well, yeah, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, born of the Father before all age, that makes sense. But how does a Jewish sage like Rashi make sense of that? And what Rashi does is Rashi says, well, no, we actually have to look at Kings, we've got to look at Daniel, and to a lesser extent, Job, and we see that God has a heavenly council. And anytime he wants to make an important decision, it's an argument about meekness, right? The meekness of the Holy One. He always checks in, even though he doesn't have to. He always checks in with his lieutenants, and Rashi cites biblical verses to that effect. Again, not to kind of complicate things too much, but this idea that sort of remind you that different people at different historical periods, based on their own relationship with Scripture, have provided their own commentaries that may or may not be grounded in the linguistic structure of the Hebrew. But more interesting, Rashi goes on to that line, male and female, he created them. And the part of the line that I just love about this is, in one sense, he like Jesus, will go on and connect this line on the sixth day of creation to the creation of Eve, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But this is what Rashi says in a midrash. He says, according to the midrashic explanation, he created him at first with two faces, and afterwards he divided them. The real sense of the verse here is that you were both created on the first day, but it doesn't explain how the creation took place. So what Rashi says is that, in the Jewish tradition, right, the ancient Hebrews struggle with this, and Adam is kind of an intersex being. He doesn't conform to that XY binary. He has multiple faces. He is, the Adam that's presented in Scripture might also find himself on the receiving end of the Vatican's disapproval, if we're sort of follow this older Hebrew tradition. So again, proceeding to the second creation story, I don't want to take up too much time because I know I'm going over. But what does Adam and Eve teach us? And how do we sort of, as LGBT plus Catholics, find a space for, building our lives and being creators of our own family in a book that seems to suggest that, only male and female, are the natural order of creation, and certainly that's the only legitimate mode of coupling, right? Genesis 2:24 says, therefore, after Adam creates Eve out of the rib, and again, we could spend a whole semester figuring this story out. He says, therefore does a man leave his father and his mother and cling to his wife and become one flesh. Robert Alter keys us into the word therefore as a kind of etiological indicator to say, okay, this is how we know this is myth. Because that therefore is kind of like in a fable when Aesop says the moral of the story is, and it's a way of saying this, don't read us too literally. It's an idea of kind of recognizing that creation has its own sovereignty, that you do individuate and you are complemented by your partner. Again, it seems to suggest a gender binary. But as we've seen in other interpretations of the first Genesis encounter, that's gender binaries of this period don't necessarily map on to our understanding of gender and creation in our own time, just as various interpreters have updated the story to answer the pressing theological questions of their age, up to and including Yeshua, our Jesus. Again, in Matthew, Matthew 19:3-4, and this is the line that Pope St. John Paul keys into in his theology of the body. It's the same line that the Catechism keys into for identifying the scriptural basis for the sacrament of marriage. And certainly, it's non-threatening to LGBT plus Catholics, but here's what Jesus does. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And for any and every reason. And the background, of course, is that in the Torah, in the Mosaic law, there are elaborate rules for divorce, sex and sexuality, polygamy. And Jesus says, haven't you read? He's such a nerd. I love him. Haven't you done the readings? Like an angry professor. That is at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female, he said. And for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Well, Jesus said it's male and female, I guess case closed. Well, not quite. Because if we go on to read Matthew 19, he goes on to say, these laws were created as a way to reify sin. But ultimately, it's not about, again, Jesus is not concerned with the legal or canon law aspects of marriage. What he wants to say is that when two people come together, that relationship is synergetic, that two become greater than the sum of their parts. He's referring back to Genesis, even though he's collapsing two stories, so he's not necessarily being a good historian. He's being a very good theologian here. But what I would say is what Jesus says is completely consistent with this larger argument about interdependence, accountability. And really what he's saying is love is love. If God is love, and the relationships we have are derivative of that love, right? We're made in the image and likeness of that, then you cannot commit a crime against love. Again, he's not so angry about divorce as much as it's adultery, right? You betray that love. And indeed, Jesus Christ will die, right, as a result of betrayal of his own friends. So this is something he knows quite intimately. And again, in the context of the larger description of the gospel, it really is kind of irresponsible to say that this historical reading forecloses on evolutions and new understandings of what it means to be complementary, interdependent, and indeed to love someone authentically. And of course, at the end of the Adam and Eve story, we get to this part, the part that has haunted women for centuries to come, has given birth to the dogma of original sin. But again, as Robert Alter shows us, this is a story about not necessarily timeless gender roles, but how gender and sexuality and interdependence are evolving to confront the new environmental, economic, and political realities of life on Earth. So we know Adam and Eve in the garden, the fall of the snake. I don't want to unpack all that. But after, the they have their their confrontation with God. God says to the woman, I will terribly sharpen your birth pangs. In pain you shall bear children. And it's pretty harsh stuff. And to Adam, you shall eat the plants of the field. By the spread of your brow you shall eat bread till you return to the soil. For there you were dust. From there you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. We know this line. Okay, it seems pretty unambiguous. Well, for one thing, the fall is not necessarily referring here to the consequences of sin as much as it does preserve a major ecological shift that we can look at in the sort of the tree ring record and the sort of the climate record of the Near East. About 4,000 years ago, more so in some areas, the Earth's climate became cooler and drier. And so places where economy, you could go into a field and have all the wild wheat you want, the animals literally came to you. Suddenly, as the world gets drier, agriculture becomes more intensive. And once you shift from these early ecosystems, these early sort of subsistence economies that archaeologists have identified in places like southern Turkey, at Karahoyak, for example, to these more intensive agrarian settlements like Jericho, you also start to see the accumulation of wealth. So income inequality, you have haves and have-nots. You start to see women who had initially, at least for thousands of years before this period, had enjoyed a kind of sacred place, and you see these wonderful little idols, or these sort of fertility goddesses all over the Near East, all over Persia. Now, those gender balances, those gender relationships are out of balance. And so what these early Hebrews were trying to figure out was not necessarily why are we in exile, why are we a fallen people, why does God keep sending, the Babylonians, why has our temple been destroyed? But initially, we knew there was a time when there wasn't this kind of income inequality. We knew there was a time when women's sacred and regenerative powers, were valued. What has changed? And so what I want to argue is that in Genesis, we can actually see the landscape before the ancient Hebrews changing, and people are looking to this mythological story to make sense. Just as we in the 21st century, thanks to the research of folks like Kinsey, the music of David Bowie, a generation of Catholics coming out of the closet, our relationship with creation isn't necessarily changed, but we see it much more clearly now. We're participating in the creation story, just as the Patwins would go into a sweat lodge ceremony and participate and recreate their creation story. So I know I'm going over time. I'll wrap up in just a minute. Here's sort of the archaeological proof of this new hierarchical agrarian world that Adam and Eve, metaphorically or mythologically speaking, are entering into after they're expelled from the garden. I would also add that we see this happening in Native American societies. The Hurons, or the Wyandots, adopt maize agriculture around the 9th, 10th century CE. Their villages start to get bigger, but we also see that they're suffering from new diseases, crowd diseases. They're starting to get tooth decay, and they actually make sure that Algonquin-speaking peoples who maintain more extensive hunting economies and still sort of have that more intimate relationship with the forest spend the winters in their village because they perceive that they have somehow lost their spiritual power or their orenda because of this distended relationship with the land. And again, so we see the fall in Genesis, we see in other indigenous societies, not as a sign of an angry God, as much as how do we continue to endure with the people we love in the land of our birth, despite the ever-increasing pace of change. And finally, Sodom and Gomorrah. right? This is the one. You know, we get the word sodomy. Even Rashi seems to think that this verse talks about sexuality. And Robert Alter, you know, he notes that in many ways it's not so much about the men of Sodom trying to gang rape angels as much as it's a play on words. You know, the men of the city in Sodom, what are the men? Again, what Alter would say is it's an ironic interplay between the men of Sodom whose manliness is expressed in their universal impulse for homosexual gang rape, and the divine visitors who only seem to be men. Is this really, can we really extrapolate this to sort of say that loving consensual partnerships in the 21st century are inherently sodomitical? Well, of course not. Because that's not the argument the biblical author is trying to make. In many ways, he's trying to draw our attention to this kind of predatory sexuality that pervades Sodom, right? We could imagine Harvey Weinstein you know, some of these other folks who have recently been in the headlines, right? If they populated a city, right, Kevin Spacey, and they grab people without asking, you know, and seek to gratify themselves at the expense of hospitality, that's a sign of their moral depravity. It has nothing to do with their inherent sexuality in and of itself. And remember, you know, what does Lot do? You know, please don't rape my house guests. Please rape my virgin daughters. And of course, a literary interpretation says Lot will, of course, in turn, pay for this act of you know, sexual exploitation, right? Going to treat my daughters, put them on the meat market. In the end of the story, he will, of course, find himself as the victim of sexual violence. Does this have anything to do with historical interpretations of sexuality? Well, Ezekiel certainly says no. Ezekiel says, you know, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. So again, rich and powerful men who were well off, didn't love their neighbor, didn't obey the laws of hospitality, thought that they could grab guests wherever they want and do as they wished for them, like the detestable things. That is the sin of Sodom. But it gets more complicated than that, because I would argue that even this, even though it's not a story of sexuality, it does answer two very specific questions that ancient Hebrews were trying to figure out about their natural world. Specifically, why is there a large swath of territory north of the Dead Sea that was once inhabited but now seems barren? And why do we have these curious rock formations that look like someone was turned into a pillar of salt? Well, in 2018, geologists and archaeologists answered the latter question. And that about 3,700 years ago, a meteor exploded in the air over the north shore of the Dead Sea. If anyone's familiar with the meteor impact of Tunguska in Siberia in 1918, right, the meteor didn't hit the Earth, it blew up overhead. And in doing so, irradiated the city. It caused a tsunami from the Dead Sea, which took highly saline water and made dumped that salt water on the land, making the land non-productive. And so this land was uninhabitable for 600 to 700 years. And so ancient Hebrews weren't necessarily trying to make sense of gender relationships as much as they were trying to tell a story about reciprocity, hospitality. How do you preserve life in a hostile ecosystem? Well, through those relationships of interdependence, not on sexual exploitation. And again, the Vatican says, no, we're going to ignore Ezekiel, we're going to ignore geology, we're going to ignore science, and we're going to say that this is a story about sodomites. Again, may make theological sense to some, but to me as a historian, it's kind of ahistorical nonsense. So, what are the big takeaways from this reading of Genesis? Well, first of all, it's a reminder that each and every one of you is participating in this creation story. You're living in a world that's always changing, that asks us to confront difficult choices, right? What, can we do about climate change? What are we going to do about food insecurity? How can love make a family? How can we care for each other and be interdependent? How can we have a healthy sexuality without entering into relationships of exploitation and degradation like we saw in Sodom? Right? It wasn't the fact that the partners were of the same gender. It was the fact that they were being, treated like pieces of meat. And so questions to sort of begin our conversation is, how does your coming out story, how does your experience as an LGBT Catholic reenact God's song of creation in Genesis 1? And I call it the song of creation because if you ever heard the way it's sung in a Jewish liturgy, right, the book of Hebrews is sung. God doesn't have to have big bangs. God whispers, God sings, and the universe comes into creation. Another question, have you ever felt like narrow, dogmatic, or ahistorical interpretations of Genesis have denied you your rightful place in God's creation? And finally, what's your favorite way to read Genesis?